So, what it takes to beat the market, and as Ed puts it, doing better than the market is not the same as beating it. The first is often simply luck. The second is finding a statistically significant edge that makes sense, then profiting from it. So, it's often simply luck, as he puts it, doing better than the market, which brings up the topic of closing line value, which is often discussed, and we don't need to go into too much detail here, but if you always beat the closing line and then lose, what does that mean? Obviously depends by market, if it's NFL versus college football prop markets, for example. Which one is it? Closing line value, is that beating the market or is that doing better than the market? Could it be luck? Could it be skill? That whole skill versus luck discussion comes into play again. And I think the interesting aspect is if you directly apply what Ed's talking about with statistically significant edge that makes sense, is that no risk arbitrage, or is that originating and beating the market with a pretty sophisticated model that may not necessarily be sustainable? So as Ed has done, is to evolve his approach and his markets that he's playing in, and he talks about the volume he had in Asia at certain points, betting on certain things there, or investing, I should say. So it's a fascinating quote in and of itself, and how it might apply to sports or racing or different endeavors. But certainly from an investing and finance perspective, it does make sense, and I think it's probably one where, as always, people overplay their ability to beat the market as opposed to they did better than the market, and whether or not that was skill, whether it was luck, whether a skillful person got lucky, which is obviously something that probably happens a fair bit, and trying to split out that is not always that easy. A skillful person would probably want to say that they applied their skill to beat the market, and the right answer might have been the skillful person was lucky in that instance, or in that series of events or trades or whatever it might be. So it's a fascinating topic. I think largely gets into the psychology of some of these things, and it's not as easy, certainly in something like sports betting, to be able to statistically hedge, let's say, just given the approach by the industry to arbitrage and things like that. But it's a fascinating discussion, and Ed goes into detail on the four components that he thinks about when beating the market. The first, and again, this isn't necessarily private, mysterious information that's been hidden away for years and has finally come out. It's pretty obvious to most who have spent a number of years going into different markets to try and beat them. The first is good information early. Obviously, good information, you got to find that, what's correct, certainly signal versus noise and that type of thing. And obviously early is critical because you want to get out ahead of the market and bet before they are doing that. So that's certainly very applicable when it comes to injuries in sports and different line movement approaches that are clearly and often used by many. The second is be a disciplined, rational investor, being logical, applying that to your analysis. That logical thinking we've talked about prior, the scientific method to scrutinize what you're doing, which Ed uses ad nauseum, and that sound overall analysis to be able to rationally consider the opportunity or whatever it is you're trying to achieve. And one thing that is referenced in here is Occam's razor, and often just finding the simplest approach is the best starting point rather than getting into too many complex methods and modes too quickly. The third he references is find a superior method of analysis. So this is obviously the hardest one by far, and it's certainly not impossible, but it is very difficult, certainly for things that are well covered over the decades, whether it is the most efficient markets. It's obviously very hard to have a superior method of analysis, but not impossible, and we've certainly seen developments in the data space, especially when it comes to interesting approaches, let's say, using player tracking data. Obviously, Moneyball and expected goals and a lot of these things now are common parlance in sports and sports statistics. But I think that's where, moving forward, what will be the new data points, what hasn't been found yet. Can you create your own data? Obviously, people who have spent time in syndicates talk about things that were being done years and years ago. Humbleton and others with, tracking position in running of horses pretty ruthlessly to try and find advantages in those types of things. That's where, the superior method of analysis is clearly and obviously one of the easiest ways to get out ahead. And, back to the example referenced previously with Ed using the Black-Scholes method, in the late 60s before the formula was even published. and he had a number of years head start, which ultimately ended up in a Nobel Prize. But those are the types of things where, clearly if you do have a superior method, then you can have that edge far before anyone else and capitalize on it. And the final pillar is when you identify an edge, invest ahead of the crowd. Obviously, your edge diminishes as people will be betting into it, and that information is known to the market. Others will be able to find it. They'll be able to try and capitalize on it, and that edge dissolves relatively quickly, certainly in this day and age. So one other quote that was mentioned: to beat the market, focus on investments well within your knowledge and ability to evaluate your circle of competence. And I think that's obviously critical, and domain expertise, or at least understanding, is really important so you don't miss certain things, and it allows you to have the confidence in your approach so you haven't missed anything. Essentially, I would say is probably one of the aspects that jumps out is, if you're talking about, there's been discussion more recently on betting on favorites in the NFL that are down by a couple of touchdowns or 3 touchdowns or more, let's say. And a lot of the models were saying to bet on the team that was ahead, and some of those models have been losing. And obviously, people say not all 3 touchdown favorites are the same. They're not all equal. If you had Pat Mahomes or Peyton Manning versus having second string or low starting tier quarterbacks, then it's obviously very different. But that would be known by the market or factored in, you would think, at least potentially. Is it factored in enough? You get into all those discussion points. And I think the point is, if you are looking at this type of problem and topic, in-play betting in an NFL game where a favorite is down by multiple touchdowns, then being within your circle of competence, as Ed puts it, or your understanding, will allow you to approach this project, let's say, in hopefully a thoughtful way. And the process and the analysis that you use may be something that you can do because you know that. Whereas if you found someone who was very, very good at these types of projects in different fields, maybe it would take them some time to understand certain things within that domain that you might already know. So I think that's, potentially an advantage you might have because you do have that expertise or knowledge. So I think the one thing that stands out from Ed's, 4 pillars and what he talks about with respect to beating the market is that there's no sweet elixir. You need to basically have a sound process in place. You need to have logical thinking, smart application, and obviously hard work that goes into it. I think that's what comes out from the different endeavors that he was undertaking. That process element of the scientific method and understanding what the problem is and all the components that go into it. Thinking logically, going back to the very first quote, pure thought, thinking about the problem from a math perspective, physics, chemistry, chess, Morse code. How can you use those types of things to look at the problem, and then the smart application of that, which is pretty evident throughout the book, and then obviously the hard work that comes with that. So I think they're the main aspects that sort of arise when going through this theme throughout the book.